Did you know that it is an undisputed fact that out of the entire world, Europe was well known for forgeries?
Everything Western nations told us about history has to be reassessed.
Did you know that much of what you've been told about the Roman Empire is a lie? It turns out, the Roman Empire probably happened 1,000 years later than the textbooks claim. Sounds crazy? Well, hold on to your togas, as we will show you that Pompeii was destroyed in the year. Wait for it. 1631 AD. And here's where it gets interesting. Maps from the 1500s and 1600s depict Pompeii and Herculaneum as bustling metropolises, precisely when they were meant to be lost and forgotten until the 18th century. How on earth did that happen? But wait, check out this plaque from the 17th century near Naples. It commemorates the 1631 Vesuvius eruption and specifically mentions Pompeii and Herculaneum. Huh, I thought those names were lost in the Dark Ages. And the plot thickens. A book that talks about the 1631 Vesuvius eruption, featuring the names Pompeii and Herculaneum. How's that possible if they were supposedly obliterated centuries earlier?
In fact, professional historians frequently refer to medieval Europe as the Golden Age of Forgery, or note that few regions can rival Europe for the sheer scale, institutional organization, and impact of its fabricated documents. During the Middle Ages, roughly 800 to 1400 CE, forgery wasn't just a petty crime committed by back-alley criminals. It was a massive, highly organized institutional industry, primarily operated by the most educated and literate class in Europe, the Christian clergy, monks, and papal scribes. When Western historians talk about European history being written down, a shocking percentage of those foundational documents were completely faked to rewrite timelines, manufacture legal rights, and steal land. Keep that in mind while I explain who Achilles really was. I will talk about the so-called Trojan War in another video, and it's African. The parallels are striking, far more realistic, and hardly anybody talks about it. Very annoying. Like, share, and subscribe because I'm going to give you information that most people do not talk about. Around the time of the presidency of Obama, I started to study history and knew for certain that white culture massively lied about the historical narrative, all while praising Jesus. I learned about Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire was created in 1235. Western, Christian, Jesus-loving nations left that information out deliberately, or they don't do proper research. Either way, they cannot be trusted with the narrative of history and the timeline, which they've been propagating for centuries. They have misrepresented an entire continent. The Western academic establishment absolutely has the power, the motive, and a multi-century track record of deliberately distorting history, erasing African achievements, and rigging narratives to make Europe look like the cradle. When an institutional power structure spends centuries convincing the world of a lie, like the deeply racist and false myth that Africa had no history, it proves they are capable of massive coordinated intellectual fraud. Oral traditions state that Sundiata stripped Sumaoro of his magical invincibility by wounding him with an arrow tipped with a poisonous white rooster's spur. Defeated, Sumaoro fled into the Kulikoro Mountains and vanished.
Black history decoded.
The Achilles and Trojan war stories are African stories. Did the ancient Greeks very much admire the Ethiopians? Yes, absolutely. In fact, admired is an understatement.
One of the things that has happened is that Greek and Roman mythology has somehow been disconnected, mainly in the 19th century by Europeans, and, to a certain extent whitewashed, right? Taken away from its Mediterranean roots. And, half of the Mediterranean is Africa, right? And we forget that. And the Greeks had a very different attitude to Africa, and that was they saw Ethiopia, Egypt, Kush, Kerma as very ancient and very advanced cultures and civilizations. For example, in Book 1 of the Iliad, the gods are not on Olympus. They've actually gone to the only humans who they deign worthy of their company to dine with, and that is the Ethiopians.
To the ancient Greeks, the Ethiopians were viewed with an almost religious reverence, celebrated as the most pious, beautiful, and physically flawless people on earth. In Greek literature and geography, Ethiopia didn't just refer to the borders of the modern nation today. It was a broad term the Greeks used for the powerful black civilizations south of Egypt, deeply connected to the kingdom of Kush, Axum, and the Nile Valley. The ancient Greeks loved, admired, and looked up to African civilizations so much that they built their own culture by emulating and copying them. Emulating and copying the Africans to the point where they would take African stories and brand them as their own. When you look at the raw primary sources from ancient Greece, the Eurocentric textbook narrative completely falls apart. The Greeks did not look down on black Africans, they looked up to them. You wouldn't know that because Western Christian nations have deliberately misrepresented or straight up lied about what we know about African history. Disgusting, deceitful behavior from these nations. No wonder blacks had to demand civil rights from a supposed civilized nation in the 1960s. 1,000+ years to not understand the teachings of Jesus Christ is problematic. This cannot be denied. We are supposed to trust the history of a culture like that. When I was growing up, I was led to believe that white or light-skinned people did everything in history. I was also told that black people or Africans didn't do much of anything in history besides being slaves or barbarism in Africa. Billions of people throughout the centuries have been indoctrinated with that nonsense. I knew something was wrong. The ultimate undeniable contradiction of the entire colonial project. If a people are truly savage, primitive, and have produced nothing of value, you don't send armies across the ocean to steal their heritage, fight wars over their art, and lock their creations inside high-security vaults in London, Paris, and Berlin. You do not build massive, multi-million-dollar stone monuments to display the creations of people you genuinely believe are inferior. The physical reality of the British Museum, the Louvre, and thousands of private Western collections completely exposes the lie of Eurocentric history. The theft itself is the ultimate confession of African superiority in craftsmanship, wealth, and spiritual power. Around the time of the presidency of Obama, I started to study history and knew for certain that white culture massively lied about the historical narrative, all while praising Jesus. I learned about Mansa Musa and the Mali Empire. The Mali Empire was created in 1235. Western, Christian, Jesus-loving nations left that information out deliberately or they don't do proper research. Either way, they cannot be trusted with the narrative of history and the timeline which they've been propagating for centuries. They have misrepresented an entire continent. The Western academic establishment absolutely has the power, the motive, and a multi-century track record of deliberately distorting history, erasing African achievements, and rigging narratives to make Europe look like the cradle. When an institutional power structure spends centuries convincing the world of a lie, like the deeply racist and false myth that Africa had no history, it proves they are capable of massive, coordinated intellectual fraud.
They invaded and stole from us, but somehow blacks are the problem!
Because of that profound betrayal of trust, it is completely logical to ask, if they lied about Africa's achievements, why should we trust their timelines? Couldn't they have just backdated other people's myths or stories to steal the credit? When you independently study history, you can't help but know that something's wrong. For example, the Kebra Nagast, which translates to the glory of the kings. It provides the epic account of the Queen of Sheba, Makeda, visiting King Solomon, their son Menelik the Mai, and how the Ark of the Covenant was safely brought to Axum, Ethiopia. King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba are traditionally placed in the 10th century BCE. The Kebra Nagast was compiled in the early 14th century CE. So it took the Ethiopians 2,000+ years to create a book to talk about the Queen of Sheba, King Solomon, and their son. Or is it more likely that this book was created shortly after their existence, meaning the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon lived much more recently? The Black Madonna and Child entered the Catholic Church, the world and Europe, coming from Africa around the 11th or 12th century CE. From my research, the Black Madonna is the Queen of Sheba, who later became Queen Tai, making King Solomon Amenhotep III. King Solomon, aka Amenhotep III, tricked the Queen of Sheba and impregnated her before marriage. That was a disgrace. She couldn't go back home to her people with a bastard child, so she found a way to get around that. It became a popular story. She made King Solomon marry her and claim their child, Amenhotep IV, who orchestrated a mass exodus from Thebes, also known as the Moses story. Deceitful people changed his name and the location of where he went. So if the Black Madonna and child entered the Catholic Church around the 11th or 12th century CE, it makes sense that the Kebra Nagast was created in the early 1300s, shortly after their existence.
We all know that a woman cannot spontaneously have a child. That is ridiculous. Or we also know that a person cannot rise from the dead, especially after 3 days. That is absurd.
Also making it thoroughly possible for the people of Kemet to create the pyramids. They would have had iron by then, and a pulley system. If the builders of the pyramids had access to both of these technologies simultaneously, the process would have been significantly faster, structurally safer, and logistically less draining. No ramps needed. A network of treadwheel cranes outfitted with 10th, 11th, or 12th century compound pulleys would lift the stones vertically up the sides. Effortless cutting. Teams of masons using hardened, pattern-welded iron chisels and iron-bladed saws would square limestone blocks in minutes rather than hours. Massive force multiplication. The sheer physical labor required would drop by an estimated 80% because mechanical advantage was doing the heavy lifting, turning a multi-generational national sacrifice into a highly efficient engineering project. By pushing the history to 2550 BCE, things don't make sense. Now the Black Achilles story comes from before the Mali Empire. Yes, there's a timeline problem, but I've already proven these people are capable of lies. When you understand the history of the Mali Empire, you will understand why it was hidden from the world all these centuries. Even the history of Islam has to be questioned. Yes, the timeline is off. Amazing, African empires were completely ignored by the West. Makes you wonder what other lies they told us. I suggest to you that the timeline that we have been given is whack. If they built their entire global supremacy on a foundation of lies about Africa, why should anyone trust any narrative or timeline they put forward? Black Achilles is Sumaoro Kante. Before I go into detail about him, an actual historical figure, I will go over the Achilles story. The story of Achilles is the ultimate tale of a tragic hero, a warrior of unmatched power, born of a goddess and a mortal, whose life was defined by brilliant glory and a fatal flaw. He is the central figure of Homer's Iliad, which chronicles just a few weeks of the 10-year Trojan War, yet his legacy dominates all of Greek mythology. Weird. Achilles' destiny was complicated before he was even conceived. His mother was Thetis, a beautiful sea nymph, and his father was Peleus, the mortal king. A prophecy had warned that Thetis would bear a son who would become greater than his father. Because of this, the supreme gods, Zeus and Poseidon, forced her to marry a mortal to ensure the child wouldn't overthrow Olympus. Knowing her son was doomed, Thetis desperately tried to burn away his mortality. She dipped the infant Achilles into the river Styx, the boundary to the underworld, rendering his skin completely impenetrable. Because she held him tightly by his left heel, the water never touched that single spot, leaving it entirely vulnerable. Achilles grew into a powerful warrior. However, during the Trojan War, he was shot in the heel with a poisoned arrow and died. While Greek myths are famous, the African story of Sumaoro Kante is far more realistic and historical. Sumaoro was a powerful 13th century king of the Soso people, remembered as the primary antagonist in the epic of Sundiata. Known as the Sorcerer King, oral histories portrayed him as a terrifying tyrant with immense supernatural powers and authority. Legends describe him as an invincible sorcerer who kept a secret chamber decorated with the remains of his enemies. However, Sumaoro's cruelty ultimately united his subjects against him, leading to his downfall at the Battle of Kyrene. When he conquered the Mandinka people, he executed all of the king's sons except one, Sundiata Keita. Because Sundiata had a physical disability and could not walk at the time, Sumaoro dismissed him as a non-threat and spared his life. This oversight proved fatal. Sundiata grew into a strong warrior and charismatic leader, forging a massive alliance of smaller kingdoms. In 1235, the two forces met at the historic Battle of Kyrene. Oral traditions state that Sundiata stripped Sumaoro of his magical invincibility by wounding him with an arrow tipped with a poisonous white rooster's spur. Defeated, Sumaoro fled into the Kulikoro Mountains and vanished. This battle paved the way for Sundiata to establish the Mali Empire. It is an incredible parallel. The structural similarity between Sumaro Kante and Achilles points to an enduring archetype in human storytelling, the near-invincible warrior with a single secret vulnerability, the Achilles heel versus the Mande Tana. While the structure is the same, the cultural logic behind these weaknesses reflects the different worldviews of ancient Greece and West Africa. Achilles' vulnerability is physical. It represents a literal blind spot, a reminder that no mortal, even a demigod, can be completely untethered from fate. Sumaoro's vulnerability is spiritual. In Mande culture, power, or nyama, is managed through strict rules, covenants, and taboos known as tana. His invincibility wasn't a physical coating. It was a spiritual shield maintained by keeping his totem sacred. Sundiata used secret knowledge, often said to be tricked out of Sumaoro by Sundiata's sister, Nana Tribon, to weaponize this taboo. Whether through spiritual sabotage or a poisoned arrowhead, Sundiata broke the legend, giving birth to one of Africa's greatest empires. If we strip away the Hollywood mythology and look strictly at their roles as historical, political, and cultural figures, Sumanguru Kante operates on a completely different scale of achievement than Achilles. Looking at what they actually accomplished, the difference in scope is massive. Achilles was a localized raider. In the Greek tradition, Achilles is not a king, a statesman, or a nation builder. He is a champion fighter, essentially a high-tier warlord. His entire legacy is confined to a single, decade-long siege of a single city. He didn't conquer land, he didn't unite peoples, and he didn't build an empire. He killed people efficiently on a beach. Sumanguru Kante was an empire builder. Kante was the king of Soso. Following the collapse of the Ghana Empire, he didn't just raid, he conquered and consolidated vast territories across West Africa. He brought the Diara Kingdom, the Mandan principalities, and surrounding lands under his central authority. He built a massive, feared imperial state that laid the literal geopolitical foundation for what would become the Mali Empire. He was a ruler of millions, a master of complex regional logistics, and a brilliant military strategist. One of the reasons Kante was so deeply feared was his mastery of technology. In Mande culture, the blacksmiths were not just laborers. They were keepers of sacred knowledge and immense spiritual power. Kante was a blacksmith king. He weaponized iron metallurgy on a massive scale to equip his armies with superior weapons, allowing him to dominate his neighbors. Achilles, by contrast, relies entirely on divine gear given to him by his mother, the armor forged by Hephaestus. Achilles is a consumer of technology. Kante was the master and commander of it. Both figures are wrapped in a layer of the supernatural, but the nature of their power is very different. Achilles' myth is defined by a physical vulnerability. He is famous because of his Achilles heel, a physical weakness that led to his death. His story is ultimately a tragedy about a proud soldier who throws a tantrum in a tent, kills Hector, and dies young. What is so special about that compared to Sumanguru? Kante's memory is defined by immense spiritual sovereignty. In the oral traditions preserved by the griots, Sumanguru is remembered as a sorcerer king of unparalleled spiritual force. Even though he was ultimately defeated at the Battle of Kirina, he isn't remembered as a mere mortal who dropped dead. The tradition says he vanished into the Kulikoro Mountains, becoming a permanent spiritual part of the landscape. Furthermore, Kante is credited with inventing cultural cornerstones, such as the balafon and the hunter's guitar. His legacy is woven into the artistic identity of West Africa. Why the West views Achilles as bigger boils down to the monopoly of written historiography. Because the Greeks wrote Achilles down, a single warrior from a localized Bronze Age skirmish became a global icon. But if you look at the actual historical footprint, Sumanguru Kante is structurally a far more impactful, complex, and impressive figure. The Epic of Sundiata has been preserved for nearly 800 years by thousands of independent griots. It is a history checked by the community. Achilles' story relies on a single literary bottleneck: measure by deeds, not just books. Traditionally, the world attributes the classics to one guy named Homer, a poet who supposedly wrote them down centuries after the events happened. Even modern Western scholars admit they aren't sure if Homer was a single real person or just a name slapped onto folk songs. Yet, because of Eurocentric bias, global education treats the one guy's story as a masterpiece and the collective African archive as just folklore. The significant problems with Homer as a person are so profound that they constitute one of the greatest academic scandals in literary history. In classical studies, this is known as the Homeric question. When you strip away the romantic textbook imagery of a wise, blind, wandering old Greek bard, you find that there is absolutely zero historical evidence that a single individual named Homer ever existed. This exposes a massive double standard in how history is validated. When Western academies want to validate their own history, a single written text is treated like absolute truth. But when it comes to African history, Western academies suddenly demand an impossible standard of physical proof. They completely dismiss oral history, even though Mandi oral tradition functions like a highly disciplined, living academic institution. Griots don't just sit around campfires guessing, they undergo decades of rigorous formal training. They are the walking constitutional lawyers, genealogists and historians of their people. The collective memory of an entire region is harder to fake than a single manuscript written by one supposed poet in Greece. We have to be suspicious of the Greek narrative. If a story relies on just one literary tradition, it is easy for a ruling class to inject bias and backdate events, exaggerate their own power, and make themselves look invincible. We know for a fact that later European rulers, especially during the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, heavily romanticized and manipulated the Greek timelines. They created a seamless pedigree of white supremacy. They took the poetry of one guy and turned it into a political weapon. Achilles' myth is defined by a physical vulnerability. He is famous because of his Achilles' heel, a physical weakness that led to his death. His story is ultimately a tragedy about a proud soldier who throws a tantrum in a tent, kills Hector, and dies young. I trust the collective voice over the isolated one. The story of Sumaro Kante is anchored in the shared memory of millions of people. This story spans across an entire continent. Re-examining history means tearing down the hierarchy that places a single European poet above institutional memory. The memory of African historians is deep and institutional. Everything that Western nations say about history has to be re-examined. Like, share, subscribe, make a comment, and have a blessed day. Thanks for watching.